Hello everyone, and welcome to episode 93. This is the third episode in our series on the deuterostomes, and it's the second part in this little 5-part mini-series on the vertebrates. In the previous episode, I explored the taxonomy of fish, and wrapped things up with the coelacanths and the lungfish, and hinted at the evolutionary origin of the tetrapods. These lobe-finned fish, of course, are the closest living fish relatives to the tetrapods, and they served as a very nice point of transition to introduce the amphibians. To reiterate that transition for this fresh new episode, let's start with the lobe-finned fish. So these are fish whose fins are mounted on the ends of lobes, which are like stubby muscular protrusions coming out of the sides of their bodies. This gives their fins a little bit more power during the downstroke, and it also gives the ability to waddle or push themselves through the mud on the seafloor or along the coast. A critical intermediate species that links the coelacanths with the tetrapods is Canichthys, a lobe-finned fish that lived about 395 million years ago, with features on its jaws that represent a middling evolutionary stage between the fish and the tetrapods. Canichthys and related species spread into brackish and freshwater ecosystems, like swamps, estuaries, lakes, and rivers. Among them, there was a group called the Alpistostigalians, which had adapted to the shallows, to shallow water coastal ecosystems. They had a flattened body and strengthened pectoral muscles. They were using their pectoral fins to crawl over and through the mess of branches, rotting plants, rocks, and other debris that littered this muddy, shallow water habitat. During the later Devonian period, there was a gradual rise in the concentration of atmospheric oxygen, and this further promoted the use of lungs, especially in swamp environments. The ancestral bony fish had evolved a CO2 detection system to facilitate breathing, and a lubricating layer of surfactant to facilitate gas exchange. These two major evolutionary developments in the ancestral bony fish have been conserved down the whole line handed down to the tetrapods. Also in the Devonian, groups like Tiktaalik appeared, their fossils demonstrating the evolution of fins into hands and feet, with the lobes transformed into jointed fore and hind limbs. Groups like Encanthostega had developed a fully tetrapod body form, but they were also mostly or entirely aquatic. They still hadn't made much forward progress on that transition from water to dry land. In the later Devonian, the land had been sufficiently colonized by plants, as well as various arthropod animals. Coastal habitats were stabilized by the growth of ferns, calamites, horsetails, and all kinds of mosses, which gave rise to these early complex, wetland ground-based ecosystems. These were soon filled with early land-based arthropods, like millipedes, centipedes, spiders, scorpions, and all kinds of crawling and flying insects. And for all of those ancestral tetrapods, these arthropods were a pretty tasty incentive to explore out of the water. All of these big changes that were going on before and during the Devonian, these things all contributed towards gearing the early tetrapods for life on dry land. They were slowly acquiring all of these different features that served them well in a shallow water environment, and that also happened to give them several advantages on dry land. However, it appears that these early tetrapods didn't transition fully onto dry land until around the time of the late Devonian mass extinctions. To very briefly summarize a long and complex time period, the Devonian ended in a prolonged crisis. The Age of Fishes, as it's called due to the diversity and ecological dominance of the fish, was ultimately brought to an end in a series of extinction events that began about 373 million years ago. These are thought to have probably been caused by widespread ocean anoxia, but what caused that is more uncertain. The entire planetary climate seems to have been destabilized, because after this initial mass extinction, There was a series of smaller extinction pulses leading up to a brief ice age, and then a sudden loss of biodiversity in a final extinction pulse at the very end of the Devonian around 359 million years ago. This painfully prolonged series of extinction events destroyed many coastal and reef communities, and the tetrapod ancestors, those that still dwelled in the water, were largely destroyed as well. These events served to propel the tetrapods out of the water, because by the time they reappear in the fossil record, some 15 million years later, after extensive ecological recovery, they've adapted fully to life on dry land, requiring water only as a place to lay their eggs and grow their larvae. So while many of these ancestral tetrapod groups were destroyed, they were wiped out completely, many other groups escaped, and their populations were so reduced that we found almost none of their fossils in the record from this time, this intervening period of ecological recovery. This happens to be right when the ancestral amphibians emerged in this recovery period in the early Carboniferous. Some of these early amphibian groups include the genera of the subclass Temnospondyli, including Echoloma and Tersomius. The true amphibians emerged soon after, including the so-called microsaurid genera like Pentylus, Tuditanus, and Pelodosotus, the nectridian genera like Uricordylus and Diploceraspis, and then the Lissamphibia. This final subclass, Lissamphibia, is the only branch of the amphibian dynasty that still lives in the modern day. Everything else that I mentioned there has gone extinct, and most branches that have emerged from within Lissamphibia have gone extinct as well. So this is like the crown group of the modern amphibians. Everything that's alive today has descended from this one group. Within Lissamphibia, there are 4 major clades. One of them, the Allocaudata, was represented by salamander-like amphibians which existed for about 160 million years, but they have very recently gone extinct. I say recently only from an evolutionary context, as they went extinct just about 2.5 million years ago. And that's a long time, but if you're talking about the movement of continents or the evolution of species, 2.5 million years isn't actually that long. Anyway, this leaves 3 extant Lissamphibian groups. The taxonomic order of these groups is not completely nailed down yet, but it's believed that the clade Salientia is the most basal, followed by Caudata and Gymnophiona. The clade Salientia includes the frogs and the toads. The clade Caudata includes the salamanders and the newts, and the clade Gymnophiona includes the Caecilians. Each group is also littered with its fair share of extinct cousins, but as with all the other episodes in these series, I'll only be focusing on the currently extant groups within them. So, to begin, let's look at the Salientia subclass, with its only extant order, Anura. All of the 6,200 species of frogs and toads alive in the world today belong to the Anura order, spread across 53 families. The most primitive of these are the 4 species of the New Zealand-based Liopelmatidae family, and the tailed frogs of the Ascaphidae family. These North American frogs are really primitive, but their tails aren't actually the evolutionary relic of an ancestral tail. It's actually the male cloaca, which extends outside of the body like a bag that's being dragged behind it, and it only looks like a tail. Other primitive Anura clades include the Bombinatoridae family, with their brightly colored bellies, the painted frogs and midwife toads of the Alididae family, the tropical frogs of the Pipidae family, which are aquatic frogs that don't have tongues, the Mexican burrowing toads of the Rhinophrynidae family, the American spadefoot toads of the Scaphiopodidae family, the parsley frogs of the Peloditidae family, the European spadefoot toads of the Pelobatidae family, the camouflaged litter frogs of the large and diverse Southeast Asian Megaphrynidae family, the ghost frogs of the Heliophrenidae family, which are only found in the mountain streams of South Africa, the 2 species of South Indian purple frogs of the Nasica batrachidae family, and the Seychelles frogs of the Zooglossidae family, which are unusual because some of their species lay eggs on moist ground instead of in the water, and little froglets are born instead of tadpoles. After these more primitive frog families emerged, there was a major division in the frog lineage, producing two large clusters of families. These two large clusters, or superfamilies, are the Notogeonura and the Rhinoides, which have no less than 23 and 15 families, respectively. I'll start with the Rhinoides, as this is the smaller superfamily. We should get through this a little bit quicker, and then we'll move on to the Notogeonura. Within the Rhinoides, which are mostly, but not all, from sub-Saharan Africa, the most basal families include the small, narrow-mouthed frogs of the Microhylidae family, which enjoys an unparalleled diversity of genera among all the frog families. There's also the stubby, round-shaped African rain frogs of the Brephicipitidae family, the shovel-nosed frogs of the Hemipsodidae family, the brightly colored and mostly arboreal bush frogs and sedge frogs of the Hyperolidae family, and the tree frogs of the Arthroleptidae family. More intermediate groups within the Rhinoides include the grassland frogs of the Tychodenidae family, the tropical dancing frogs of the Microxylidae family, the dwarf puddle frogs of the Phrynobatrachidae family, and the slippery frogs of the Conrauidae family, which includes the largest frog species in the world, Conraua goliath. Additionally, there are the African torrent frogs and rocky river frogs of the family Petropetetidae, the moss frogs and mongrel frogs of the family Pyxocephalidae, the small robust frogs of the family Nyctobatrachidae, and the leaping frogs of the family Ranaxalidae, which are both found in India. And then you have the Ceratobatrachidae frogs found all over the islands of Southeast Asia and Oceania. More derived groups of Rhinoides frogs include the tropical fork-tongue frogs of the family Dicroglossidae, and the frogs of the Rhacophoridae family, which includes a wide variety of species that inhabit the world's tropical forests, from Africa, across southern and Southeast Asia, all the way to eastern China and Japan. The Mantelidae family is a group of very brightly colored frogs endemic to Madagascar and Mayotte, and it includes three very biodiverse divisions: the aquatic and amphibious Mantelinae, the large terrestrial Laliostomini, and the arboreal, bright-eyed skeleton frogs of the Buffinae. The final family within the Rhinoides is the Ranidae, or the true frogs. This Ranidae family of true frogs includes species that can be found all over the world, although most of them are found in Asia. Specifically, they're found in the forests and island chains of Southeast Asia. But as the entire clade is generally so widespread and it has member species that inhabit so many different habitats, these true frogs have radiated into a wide diversity of species. Some of them live entirely in trees, while others are almost fully aquatic. And a small handful, such as the crab-eating frog, are some of the only frogs that can live in brackish water. Now, the other superfamily I mentioned was the Notogeonura. Primitive clades within Notogeonura include Chilean toads of the family Calyptocephalelidae, the Australian water frogs and ground frogs of the family Myobatrachidae, which are known for their unique style of parenting. The female will swallow the eggs and then incubate them inside her body. And then there's the Australian ground frogs of the Linodynastidae, the South American Crogostorid frogs of the Cuthomantidae family, the tiny, brightly colored saddleback toads and the larger but less colorful Ischnochnema frogs of the Brachycephalidae family, the rain frogs of the Eleutherodactylidae family, and the often brightly colored fleshbelly frogs of the Crogostoridae family. Some of the intermediate groups of the Notogeonura frogs include the really strange frogs of South and Central America from the Hemiphractidae family. Among other strange features, they're known to carry their eggs on their back instead of depositing them in a body of water or in very moist soil. Another intermediate Notogeonura group is the massive Hylidae family of tree frogs. Now, this is actually one of my favorite animal families, because within the Hylidae, you'll find groups like the Phrynomedusa colored leaf frogs, the Tepuhyla Amazonian tree frogs, the tripod shovel-headed tree frogs, and the Plectrohyla spike thumb frogs, among many others, and they're all really, really cool. They might be really tiny, or really brightly colored, or beautifully patterned. They could be dangerous, perhaps from a poison or a toxin, or they're just really interesting in some other way. A lot of the more derived notogeonuran clades are also really interesting too. There's the southern frogs of the Leptodactylidae family, the Tukiat hill frogs of the Alphrynidae family, and the glass frogs of the Centrolenidae family, which are named after their translucent skin. If you look at a glass frog up close, you can see their organs and their intestines through their skin. It's super wild. Then you have the true toads of the Bufonidae family, which are known for the bufotoxin they produce and secrete through their parotid glands. This includes toads like the Ancilius alvarius, whose secretions can induce psychoactive effects. Then there's the cryptic poison frogs of the Aromobatidae family, who are only somewhat less toxic than the poison dart frogs and their sister clade, Dendrobatidae. These very charismatic Dendrobatidae frogs include many very brightly colored species, and, with a lot of overlap in this Venn diagram, a lot of very toxic species. The poisons secreted onto the skin of these poison dart frogs include various lipophilic alkaloids like batrachotoxin, histrionicotoxin, and pumiliotoxin 251D. The most toxic poison dart frog is the golden dart frog, the Phylogeny terribilis, whose species name, terribilis, comes from its highly lethal batrachotoxin. Just one golden dart frog contains enough poison to kill 10,000 mice, or between 10 and 20 humans. That's pretty intense, and kind of terrifying, hence terribilis. Now we're in the final stretch for Anura. The final group of frog and toad families can be found all over South America, from the swamps and jungles of Brazil to the forests and rivers of Chile and Argentina. These include the common horned frogs of the Ceratophryidae family, the primarily aquatic or mostly aquatic frogs of the Telmatobiidae family, the mouth-brooding frogs of the Rhinodermatidae family, and the frogs of the Alsodidae, Hylotidae, Batrachialidae, Odonotophrynidae, and Cyclorhamphidae families. Okay, that was a mouthful. Let's take a moment to regroup. What we just went through was a quick sprint through the huge collective of frog families. Now, if we step back a bit and refer to the ancestors of the frogs, we'll come to a clade called Batrachia. Descended from the Batrachia are, of course, the frogs and toads of the order Anura, but there's another lineage, a sister lineage to the Anura. This is the clade Caudata, which includes all species of newt and salamander. These amphibians are tetrapedal like the frogs, but they have a flattened, elongated body that's much more reminiscent of lizards, particularly in the way that they walk, with their limbs protruding outward to the side. In addition, where Anura is the only surviving frog clade within the larger Salientia clade, the clade Caudata also has only one surviving order, known as the Urodela. These are the only surviving salamanders that exist in the world's wetlands, swamps, forests, and riparian zones. The Urodela itself is split into 3 major divisions. The most basal division is the Cryptobranchoidea, or the giant salamanders, which includes the 2 families Cryptobranchidae and Hyenobiidae. Now, the Cryptobranchidae are fully aquatic salamanders, divided into the Cryptobranchus and Andrius genera. The Cryptobranchus genus has a single species, known as the hellbender, Cryptobranchus alleganiensis, which is a huge mottled salamander found in the central and eastern United States. Its relative, the Andrius genus, includes 3 extant species that can be found in East Asia. These are the Chinese giant salamander Andrius davidianus, found in the Yangtze River basin, the South China giant salamander Andrius ligoi, and the Japanese giant salamander Andrius japonicus. Also found in Asia, and mostly in Japan, are the Asiatic salamanders of the family Hyenobiidae. Compared to the closely related Cryptobranchidae, the Hyenobiidae are a large and diverse family, with some 9 extant genera and 81 known species. These include the clawed salamanders of the Onychodactylus genus, the chunky, broad, Changchin stout salamander and the Pachyrynobius genus, the Siberian salamanders of the Salamandrella genus, Asian salamanders of the Hyenobius genus, the Central Asian salamander and the Ranodon genus, the Middle Eastern stream salamanders endemic to Iran and Afghanistan in the Paradactylodon genus, the stream and mountain salamanders of the Batrachopteris genus, the Sichuan salamanders of the Liwa genus, and the Pseudohyenobius genus, which includes the yellow-spotted salamander Pseudohyenobius flavomaculatus. A more derived division within Urodela is the Salamandroidea, or the advanced salamanders. This group contains 6 families: the Ambystomatidae, the Amphiumidae, the Plethodontidae, the Proteidae, the Rhyacotritonidae, and the Salamandriidae. So let's start with the top. The Ambystomatidae family includes the mole salamanders of the genus Ambystoma, such as the humongous tiger salamander, Ambystoma tigrinum, and the Pacific giant salamanders of the genus Dicamptodon. The Amphiumidae family includes the single genus Amphiuma, with member species known as conger eels or Congo snakes, due to their particularly long tails. This genus includes 3 species, called the one-toed, the two-toed, and the three-toed Amphiuma, with their respective scientific names being Amphiuma foliter, Amphiuma means, and Amphiuma tridactylum. The next Salamandroidea family is the Plethodontidae, and this is a pretty sizable family, with almost 480 species of lungless salamanders. As you might expect from the name, these salamanders, unlike every other amphibian, don't have lungs. Where most amphibians breathe through a combination of their lungs and gas exchange across their skin, the Plethodontidae rely exclusively on gas exchange through their skin. The largest genus in this large family is the Bolidoglossa, or the mushroom-tongued salamanders, which is a name that comes from their distinctive ability to shoot out their tongue at prey like a frog. This genus is actually so large that it makes up about 1/5 of all salamander species. So of all salamanders alive today, about 20% of them belong to the family Plethodontidae. Now, the Proteidae family is a relatively small clade of aquatic salamanders known as mud puppies and water dogs. Like many amphibian families, most of its genera are long extinct. In the Proteidae family, only 2 genera remain: the Necturus genus, which includes 6 species like the Red River mudpuppy Necturius louisianensis, and the Alabama water dog Necturus alabamensis. The other genus, Proteus, has just a single species, the Proteus anguinus, also known as the olm, which is a fully aquatic, cave-dwelling species. Because the olm lives in caves, in utter darkness, its skin lacks pigment, and it's a tannish, pinkish-white color. The peoples in the Balkans call it the human fish because of its eerie, unsettling skin tone. It's also blind, but its auditory and olfactory senses are extraordinarily sensitive. In the Rhyacotritonidae family, there's 4 species of cascade or torrent salamanders. These are all relatively small salamander species that are found in the Pacific Northwest. And last among these families of the Salamandroidea suborder is the Salamandriidae family, which consists of the so-called true salamanders and the newts. These creatures have unusually rough skin for an amphibian, and they can be found across most of the world. The Salamandroidea includes many genera such as the Calatriton brook newts, the Cynops firebelly newts, the darkly colored, lizard-looking Echinotriton salamanders, the brightly colored Ichthyosaura newt, the darkly colored, lizard-looking Echinotriton salamanders, the Omatotriton banded newts, the Paramesotriton wart-covered newts, the Triturus crested newts, the Tylotriton crocodile newts, the Lycian salamanders of the genus Lycia salamandra, the fire salamanders of the genus Salamander, and many more. And now we come to the final division of salamanders in Urodela, which contains just a single family. This is the Sirenoidea division, and the Sirenidae family, which contains the aquatic salamanders known as the sirens. These strange watery salamanders are known for their long, narrow, almost snake or eel-like bodies. But unlike the snakes, the sirens have fully formed forelimbs, although these are particularly small and not very strong. These tiny arms are used more so for navigating submerged debris like kelp forests or seaweed and tree branches in the water, or just generic rocks and rubble covered with slimy algae. The sirens don't have hind limbs, and instead they propel themselves with their long tail. Every species of siren can be found in some muddy plain or swamp in North America, somewhere from Mexico across the southeast US into the Everglades of Florida, and all the way north up to the Great Lakes. These are the dwarf sirens of the genus Pseudobranchus, which includes the southern dwarf siren Pseudobranchus axanthus, and the northern dwarf siren Pseudobranchus striatus. And the other genus is the siren genus, which includes the dwarf siren, or the lesser siren, Siren intermedia, the greater siren, Siren lacertina, and the leopard eel, or the reticulated siren, Siren reticulata. Both the greater siren and the reticulated siren are quite large. They're almost beefy, being some of the largest amphibians in North America, and even in the world, second only to specimens of the record-holding giant hellbender salamander. Alright, so we're nearing the end of this episode on amphibian biodiversity, on amphibian taxonomy. And the last thing that we're going to talk about is that final, third surviving major clade of Lysamphibia that I mentioned at the very beginning of the episode. You had the Anura, the frogs and the toads. You had the Urodela, the salamanders and the newts. And you also have the Gymnophiona, more commonly known as the Sicilians. These are really unique amphibians that can be found across the Amazon rainforest and the surrounding tropical habitats. But they can also be found in Mesoamerica, along strips of tropical coastline on either side of Africa, and scattered across the jungles and river valleys of Southeast Asia. The Sicilians are unique among amphibians for several reasons. Cosmetically, the most obvious difference is the complete lack of legs. They are the only amphibians who don't have any limbs at all. This lack of legs, combined with their long tube-like bodies, makes it really easy to mistake some of the smaller Sicilians for worms and some of the larger Sicilians for snakes. To illustrate this with a really superficial comparison, they kind of look like sirens that have lost their forelimbs. The Sicilians use their bony head as a shovel to move around the soil, which is how they dig tunnels and burrow through the mud. Another major difference is that the Sicilians are the only amphibian clade whose species all reproduce using internal insemination. Things start to really diverge from here, however, as 25% of Sicilians give birth to eggs, while 75% give birth to live young. Now, the Sicilians can be divided into 10 families. The most basal and primitive of these families are the beaked Sicilians of the Rhinotrammatidae family, which still possess archaic features that other Sicilians have lost, like a tail and a mouth that's on the front of the skull and not recessed underneath it. And similarly, there's the apparently primitive Ichthyophiidae family, or the fish Sicilians, which are characterized by their fish-like, non-recessed mouth, their fish-like scales, and their fish-like posterior features. Both the Ichthyophiidae and the Rhinotrammatidae are known to lay their eggs in moist soil, instead of in an actual body of water. The most diverse families are the Cicilidae, which includes 2 genera and several dozen species, and the Siphonopidae family, which includes 5 genera and also several dozen species. On the other hand, one of the least diverse families is the newly discovered Cichlidae, the Indian Caecilians, which has just 4 species. Closely related to the Cichlidae is the Herpelidae family of African Caecilians, including the bluish-gray Usamabara Caecilians and the Congo Caecilians. Other African Caecilians exist in the Scalicomorphidae family, which are all blind, possessing only vestigial eyes attached to the base of a pair of tentacles. Curiously, these Caecilians don't have stapes bones in their middle ear, which is a trait unique to them among not just the rest of the Caecilians, but among the rest of the tetrapod vertebrates. Every other tetrapod vertebrate has that stapes bone in their middle ear, which is part of the sensory structure, the auditory structure that allows them to detect vibrations in the air and stuff, and to hear. But these Caecilians, they don't have that bone. They're the only vertebrates that don't. Moving on, the Indotyphlidae family can be found in Africa, India, and the Seychelles as well. It includes specimens like Cooper's Black Caecilian, Praslinia cooperi, the Aleku or Ethiopian Caecilian, Silva Caecilia grandisoni, and the Mukumunu Asumbo Caecilian, Idiocranium roselli. The Typhlonectidae family, known as the rubber eels, is a moderate clade composed of 15 species of aquatic and semi-aquatic Caecilians that mostly give birth to live young. These rubber eels live in the mountain streams and rivers and lakes that descend out of the Andes Mountains and fall into the forests and plains of southern Argentina. And lastly, there's the Dermophiidae family. This is a really curious Caecilian family because they look like gigantic earthworms, but also because they're the only Caecilian family that exclusively gives birth to live young. Okay, so that's about the entirety of the Caecilian taxonomy, as well as the salamander and the frog taxonomy. If we step back a bit and look at this entire lineage from an evolutionary perspective again, these amphibians, this whole group, this entire massive, hundreds of millions of years old lineage would dominate the world's dry land habitats for the rest of the Devonian, and well into a good portion of the Carboniferous, too, until a series of extinction events knocked them down. Namely, the Carboniferous rainforest collapse, and the unimaginably destructive Permian-Triassic extinction event. All of these events destroyed many lineages of primeval amphibian, making ecological room for the rise of the reptiles. These reptiles were recently evolved tetrapods that could better withstand the hot, dry conditions present after the extinction events. They were hardier, with thicker skin that was better at sealing in moisture, with sharper claws and teeth intended for larger, more formidable prey. Most importantly, the reptiles were amniotes. Their eggs possessed a protective, nutritive layer called an amnion that allowed the reptiles to lay their eggs on dry land and not in the water. This freed them up to migrate and colonize deeper inland, to drier, less hospitable areas. This is all really fascinating stuff, but we'll get into reptile taxonomy in the next episode. As for this episode on amphibian taxonomy, we've come to the end. This was a really fun journey through a unique and incredible clade of animals. They've always captured my attention as a clade that was both weird and exotic, but also somewhat humble and unassuming. They're like the psychedelic shaman of the animal world. That metaphor makes no sense, but it's my best attempt to describe what I feel as the arcane, ancient, primordial personality of the amphibians among all the other tetrapods. Alright, I'm just rambling now, so let's wrap this up. This has been episode 93. If you enjoyed it, then hit that like button. And if you want more, then subscribe to the channel so you can see new videos right when I publish them. And as I said a moment ago, we'll be exploring the taxonomy of the reptiles in the next episode in the series on the deuterostomes and this mini-series on the vertebrates, so be sure to subscribe and check it out. And if you want to support the podcast in other ways, Then check out the official store, buy some cool biology art that I made myself, or become a supporter on Patreon. There are tiers as low as $1 and $2 a month. So if you think that's worth it for this cool little biology podcast, then please, by all means, sign up and become a Patreon supporter. And as always, thank you so much for listening.